going to read a story by Abby Poyen Whittier, the wife of Mathew Franklin Whittier, myself in the 19th century. And this is called Old Alice. It was published posthumously by Mathew in the August 3rd, 1850 Boston Weekly Museum, which is what I have here. I'm going to be reading from the original. I'm not going to give too much information on this by way of introduction. All I'll say is that I am convinced by the strength of the evidence that Abby and Mathew were the original authors of A Christmas Carol, so you will now see Abby's style here. Old Alice by the author of Mary Mahoney, which was signed AP. That was the first of the series for Abby Poyen. Chapter 1. Just in the lonesomest hollow of the lonesomest byroad in all New England, in a little old rickety hut, all alone, lived old Alice Hughes. Poor old Alice. The road was lonesome, the hollow was lonesome, the house was lonesome, yet the old creature's heart, the neighbors said, if ever human sympathy got into it, must have been the loneliest prison house in all Christendom. Out upon the supposition, though, just as though anyone had seen inside of it, spinster as she was, or as though we might presume this so-called Christendom to be so entirely peopled by angelic spirits. Old Alice had her own characteristics, of course, as who that really lives has not, and people must needs talk of the Mrs. Hemans of America, the American Scott, American Dickens, and as though in the infinity of God those resemblances were not entitled to an identity of their own, or it were far higher honor to be represented on time's panoramas as shadows of tall mountain peaks than veritable little hills themselves. Old Alice was misanthropic, jealous, gripping and selfish, better suited, it was said, with sitting down and brooding on some fancied injury than making glad with the most genial spirits in the universe. But then she was without relatives in the great world, and perhaps these blemishes had grown out of her loneliness unconsciously. She was a very spinster of the olden time, and alas, that this old maidism has so degenerated. No blue stockings did Alice wear, no high-life airs and monstrous-sounding words had she, or hobbies of reform, or theories of women's rights. She was just a quiet, unpretending being, delighting in set terms and cleanly habits, deeply read in signs and omens, eschewing too much converse, and going her solitary way a mark of propriety and order. There was the ancient little light stand that was regularly arrayed for meals, the one forlorn old chair, one cup and spoon, knife and fork, all telling the one same tale, a, quote, lone woman indeed, a, quote, Goody Blake, save, as the neighbors said, they missed the goody, and her name was never Blake, in very earnest. But the sun shines down on the poor bog just as benignly as on the choicest garden, and the hut would have been an unblessed thing indeed if flowers had not bloomed and birds sung about it sometimes as well as everywhere else. Alice had a way of peopling her solitude with ideal beings, summoning up about her such a world of life and action as mere stiff prosy reality could never hold up its head beside. And now, a sultry summer's afternoon, she might have been seen, with the door a bit ajar, sitting there in the draught and entertaining herself royally, telling a story. It was a way she had of her own, and she told them charmingly too. This was a hideous old narrative, though, and she was just approaching the climax and was relating how there went a voice all over the house in the night time. "Where's my old arm?" So sepulchral and terrific. When chancing to glance from her work, what was her amazement to discover she was not alone. There, almost opposite her, his curly head resting against the windowsill, and his face upturned to hers, sat a little auditor, apparently as much absorbed as she. For a moment old Alice was silent in very consternation, while the intruder, who seemed rather an offhand old little being, kept his place as composedly as though it were no unusual one. "Who are you?" at length demanded Alice, recovering her speech. "Only Pat Rody," said the little boy quietly. "Pray don't leave off on my account." "Pat Rody? Pat Rody?" Old Alice started from her chair in rage. "And how came you in here, Pat Rody?" The boy pointed to the open door and said in the same easy, unawed, quaint way, "I'm only hearing the story, if you please." "The story? And you intrude yourself into people's houses in this way, do you?" "If it's a good one, I do," was the unabashed reply, and the child looked as unmoved and unconscious as at first. "Do you? Do you? Scuttle your little dirty self in here, do you? Without leave, do you? Soil my goods and bring pestilence on me, maybe, do you? Who are you, pray, and where do you come from, to dare do it?" The little boy did not answer, but lifted up his head, looked at the woman quietly for a moment, and then stole out at the door and disappeared as silently as he had come. It is wonderful what importance will attach to so trivial an occurrence in solitude. When the intruder was gone, Alice verily believed she had been entertaining an angel unawares. On the morrow he came again, however, the same boy with the same unaccountable old ways, and somehow there came into old Alice's mind images of, quote, the poor wayfaring man, and Christ blessing little children with the sight of him, and instead of sharp words, she surprised herself welcoming him, and took such pains in finishing the story to intersperse agreeable additions, he stayed the whole forenoon. The next day he was there again, and again the next day, and the next, and finally it was no more of a rarity to see his face in the house than the face of the great tall clock. He was a curiosity for a boy, very sedate and old-fashioned, very quaint in his boyish turn of thought, and with a way of listening to a tale that must have flattered even Alice's storytelling pride. The strange, ghostly narrations pleased him most, tales of imps and hobgoblins, mermaids and fairies, and he would sit there with his little hands folded, looking into the fire and pondering them in his mind for hours together. Old Alice was a kind of child with him, and the two assimilated like old cronies. Chapter 2. Ah, Pat Rody, poor ruined Pat Rody. Who would have thought of hearing such a cry as that when the little boy was having such a paradise of it in the old hut? But so it was, and in his own home, too. It was a great, chilly-looking house, covered with dark paint and surrounded by funereal poplars. Those poplars, I wonder the grim things were ever put in the ground for ornament. Pat Rody was not a child there actually, but only a poor almshouse boy who had been adopted, and his little heart had got chilled in the great dreary abode, so he had crept abroad for warmth and sunshine. There was his foster mother, with her grave old face, always busy at the everlasting housekeeping, the father hushing the house to silence with his terrible stamp, and John minding the oxen, and Nancy scolding him, nobody knew for what. No wonder he had got old in his boyhood, or that he yearned for other heirs. But now the house was crowded with neighbors, and the foster parents, instead of being at their work, sat with covered faces in the midst, as though the chilly dwelling had a funeral in it. "And how long has the charm been on him?" sighed one of the visitors, in a tone of mournful commiseration. "Poor Pat Rody!" And all the multitude echoed, "Poor Pat Rody! Poor Pat Rody!" "Charm? Do you say charm?" interrupted a sharp-voiced woman. "Charm indeed! If old Alice has got her spell about him, then he is lost surely." "Terrible!" ejaculated a chorus of voices from the crowd. Here the foster mother covered her face. "You may well say that," she begun. "There's little peace for him day or night, sunshine or storm. Oh, if you could see how white he grows, and how his flesh falls away, if you could see him hurrying to the house straight in the morning, to sit there chained under her evil eye all day. Oh, and he creeps home at last with his thoughts wandering and speech like one demented, and then his sleep, it's no uncommon sleep. He writhes and darts about the whole night long and talks. That is the most horrible of all. Talks of her mixed up, too, with spectres and bony skeletons, as though she and her troop danced about him then. Awful, awful, was echoed all around the room. A lone woman, murmured the neighbor who had spoken first. She, a lone woman? Did you ever feel the chill of her when she came by you? Why, there's a wrestle like the slide of serpent scales she carries about her always, and that evil eye of hers, did it ever fasten upon you? On me, broke out several voices. On me. Why, the very sound of her voice is like the clattering of cold clods upon the coffin lid to me. And then to see her creeping up the church aisles of a Sunday, said one. Catch her to hold up her head in the house of God. How her spirit must writhe in the time of prayer, or when the holy word is read. Oh, and did you ever mind her step, said another. Why, it's for all the world like a rumbling from the bottomless pit. A very quiet man, who had not before interfered, here suggested that possibly some of this might be fancy. Fancy, was the reply. Didn't I myself see the light burning in her window all the night long last Christmas? No Christian light, mind you, no horrible red glare, set up there like a beacon to show the evil one had got a kingdom flourishing here on the earth yet. Didn't I see her out gathering herbs the hour after midnight of the last full moon? And don't I know them that saw her dancing the witches' dance down on the frozen meadow all last New Year's night? Oh, it's awful, awful, and if Pat Rhodey's under her spell, heaven help him. Measures, it was decided, should be taken to stop the evil immediately. And there was old Alice, looking out into the stilly twilight, and thinking all was so placid and beautiful that night. She recognized the presence of the angels. It was good, she thought. There had come the breath of childhood into her hut. The old scripture was fulfilled, for the lion of her nature had nestled with the lamb, and a little child had led them. All her soul's harshness was melted into harmony, all her old misanthropy, all jealousy and petty malice and weary dreariness of life were gone, and the lone old creature looked up to the sky and watched the stars as they came out one by one, with a heart softened and lifted up to God as it had never been before. It was sweet to be there listening. She caught the music of the leaves as the evening stole on, peaceful and low and holy, and she wandered farther still among the trees. She seemed to feel the breath of the Almighty, and, like the plants, was conscious of renewed life. Farther and farther on she wandered. Poor old Alice! In the midst of it all, the crowd was upon her, and she was seized and carried away to a place of security almost before she knew of what she was accused. Gossips have preserved the tale, and much as we wish it forgotten, while the trade lasts, old Alice will still be remembered. That night she was locked up, and the room guarded as though she had been a felon. Early in the morning, though, her little friend, in spite of all remonstrances, forced his way to see her, followed, however, by his foster parents and a long train of neighbors. There was old Alice, sitting meekly at the window, and the light, the golden sunrise light, falling over her face, and it seemed to gild an expression so angelic, all started in surprise. She did not turn at their entrance, but only said softly, "Little Pat Rhodey," and as the child came up to her, and she laid her hand upon his shoulder, and stooped and kissed him, they could see, it seemed to them, looking out from her face, not the Alice of other times, but the image of a beautiful, sainted woman. "Say the old psalm softly once," she murmured, and her voice seemed melted into wondrous music. "The Lord is my shepherd." The others were awe-stricken. It was only the innocent young child who feared no evil. He stood close beside her and chanted the sacred words softly as she said, and as he sang, the old wearied head drooped lower, and finally, like a child hushed to repose by song, fell heavily upon his little shoulder. When the psalm was done, and they drew nearer, old Alice was dead. Then all was confusion. The women covered up their faces and shrieked and rushed from the house, but little Pat Rhodey laid her gently back and closed her eyes and whispered a little prayer over her, and then called them all together to tell them God was taking care of her up in the sky, for he had seen the angels lighting up her face when she was dying. I'm sorry, I had to cut the editing so many times because I couldn't keep it together for this story. This is the power of the young woman who was the more important co-author of A Christmas Carol.